Hello, and welcome to Rejected Religion Spotlight. Today's guest is Brennan Kettelle, and Brennan is a research master's student at the University of Amsterdam, and they are specializing in 19th and 20th century occultism. Brennan and I took part in a symposium mid-April hosted by the Estrogen Network, and the Estrogen Network focuses on the intersections between esotericism, gender, and sexuality. And Brennan presented a paper there, and I thought to myself, this could be something that more people could be interested in. So that was my idea and motivation behind inviting Brennan today to talk about their research into the figure of Lilith and how Lilith plays a role in the work of French poets. Well, actually, she was British, but lived in France. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
She would like to be classified as French, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Very clear. The poet's name is Renee Vivien. So, but let me first begin by welcoming you to this interview, Brennan. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been dealing with a little bit of technical issues, so hopefully everything will stay stable and calm, and we can continue with what we've been trying to do today. So before we get into your own research, Brennan, can you talk a bit about the figure of Lilith and how she's been portrayed in myths and legends throughout history?
Yes. So Lilith is perhaps one of the most enduring mythic figures. She spans throughout the lore of antiquity up until modern times. So I'll try to be brief, but with Lilith, there is a lot to cover. So we can start with her Mesopotamian origins. The etymological root of Lilith is traced back to as early as 3000 BCE in the Sumerian word lil, which means wind, breath, dust, and storm. And this association with wind also lent an association with ghosts. So right off the bat, Lilith is identified as a spirit of sorts. And again, in 2400 BCE, Lilith is found in a Sumerian king's list in which Gilgamesh's father is identified as a Lilu, which is a type of Lilith demon. And then in 2100 BCE, Lilith makes her first literary appearance in the tale Gilgamesh and the Hulabu tree, in which a tree belonging to Inanna is used as a house for three creatures: a snake, an Anzu bird, and Kisikil Lily, which is Lilith. And as the tale goes, Gilgamesh went to chop down this tree so the goddess Inanna could have wood. He slayed the snake, and Lilith and the Anzu bird fled, which I believe is kind of the foundations for later associations with Lilith and snakes and birds, specifically owls. Okay. Yes. So, and then in the rest of Mesopotamia, the Akkadian word lilitu refers to windstorms and wind demons. And then the Babylonian lilitu is also found along with Lilu, being kind of a legion of harmful spirits. So it is important to note that up until the Middle Ages, before Lilith is kind of personified as a singular entity, Lilith was pluralized, so a category of demon, I guess. The Ardot lily in Babylon, or Babylonian contexts, were essentially succubae who would prey on men during their sleep. And then the Irdu lily were the male counterpart who would prey on human women. Lilith is also found in Babylonian incantation bowls, kind of illustrated in chains, most likely of iron, which is further evidence that even before Lilith was incorporated into Hebrew demonology, she was viewed as demonic. And then the Lilitu demon was eventually conflated with the Babylonian demoness Lamashtu. who was this child-killing hag, who was both a monster and a goddess, yet overall feared. She was an early vampire archetype, very malevolent against pregnant women. She ate men, drank blood, caused nightmares in barren lands. The classic demonic femme.
Right.
Yes. She also would appear as a lion, donkey, bird hybrid, which again are animals that would later be associated with Lilith as well. A fun fact, or a pop culture fact about Lamashtu, is that her nemesis was the equally evil Pazuzu, who was a male Babylonian demon. You may have heard of him.
Yes,
so
I have.
Ancients used to... I know, this was my fun fact, that the ancients used to summon Pazuzu in order to get rid of Lamashtu. But Pazuzu is the demon in The Exorcist who possessed Reagan.
Yes.
So it comes full circle, yes.
Pop culture.
Scare stuff. Pop culture is everywhere. So, also, in Canaanite and Hebrew cultures, there was also a winged female demon who killed children. There's a 7th century BCE tablet that specifically illustrates this, inscribed, with an inscription along the lines of, "Oh, she who flies at night, be gone, Lilith." So she really kind of took over the Mesopotamian and Canaanite culture as a whole. And then centuries later, in a Greek and Roman contexts, Lilith is aligned with the Greek Lamia and the Roman Strix. Lamia has her own kind of little myth, similar, I'd say, to Lilith's myth, in that Lamia was a mistress of Zeus, and then all of her children were killed by Hera, who was jealous. And this rage and sorrow transformed Lamia into a night-roaming demon who kills children and, again, drinks blood. So the vampire myth is also really embedded into the early foundations of Lilith. And the Lamia actually informed the medieval and early modern stereotypes of witches as kind of sexually vampiric, performing evil at night and killing children. And again, the Roman Strix was also a nighttime monster preying on children and men. A little different, though, with the Strix. She could transform into a seductive, beautiful woman. And she was also associated with blood consumption and owls, which is then also how the later Christian idea of witches flying around on brooms and murdering children came to be as well. Lastly, within this kind of a Greek pantheon, the 3rd century Greek work, The Testament of Solomon, discussed a female demon who is known by tens of thousands of names, again, travels at night, attacks pregnant women, newborns, etc. And then moving into Hebrew demonology, Lilith is kind of cemented in Hebrew demonology in the book of Isaiah, 34:14, where she is named as an unclean spirit, associated with or in the company of jackals and wildcats and kind of this barren desert wasteland. She's also mentioned in some Midrashic accounts of what happened to Adam during a period of separation from Eve after the fall. There was a Lilith, again, plural, named Pisnai, who seduced Adam and bore demonic broods of his seed. And then a few centuries later, of course, the satirical medieval midrash, the Alphabet of Ben Sirah, expanded on Lilith's myth, and this is the text that kind of birthed the Lilith that we know today. So it combined all of this numerous lore from previous centuries, encapsulated Lilith as one singular entity, and what some scholars would say was used as a means of solving a biblical discrepancy in Genesis. it's important to note that this text was supposed to be satirical, but the satirical intentions of the Alphabet of Ben Sira are completely secondary now to the impact that this text had on Lilith's narrative in future folklore, cultural receptions, etc.
That's very interesting. And what is that? What is the discrepancy?
Because the biblical discrepancy is it is in one Bible verse. Essentially, it says God created man and women; He created them. Mm-hmm. And then in another Bible verse, it describes Eve being created from the rib.
Yes.
And so it sounds as though Adam had a wife before Eve.
Right.
And so this was the discrepancy.
Yes.
Yeah. I think it was Genesis 1:2. I should fact check myself.
I will make sure that I get that edited in. But yeah, that is something that not a lot of people know about. People read the Bible every day, but they're not really, I don't know, maybe some people are, but most people that I know and talk to, they don't know these what do you mean there's two women in the Bible in the creation story? What are you talking about? Well, it says right here. It's a funny thing. But,
yes.
Okay. But that's very interesting about the text being meant as a satire, and that people completely have lost the point of the text.
Yes. I think the story right before the one on Lilith was about a king's daughter's 1,000 farts.
Oh my God.
And so this is the context of, this is what the myth of Lilith is placed next to. Now this myth that has taken on a life of its own as kind of this the representation of Lilith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Super interesting stuff. I learn something every day. I learn something new every single day. I kid you not. All right. Well, Lilith, as we've already mentioned, Lilith is a popular character in pop culture, occultism, and modernity. She pops up in all sorts of contemporary media. Just to name a few, she was the first vampire in the series True Blood. She was a demon in the TV series Supernatural. She merged with the character of Madame Satan in the chilling adventures of Sabrina. And that was probably the most recent, that I know of, the most recent depiction of Lilith. It's that latest season just came out not too long ago. But she's also in games such as Vampire the Masquerade, Diablo 2 and 4. You sent me that great clip of Lilith being called forth. That was beautiful, beautiful graphics there. And she is the mother of Nephilim, and the Nephilim are the race of giants that were the product of the mating of human and angels, if I am correct. I'm getting my facts straight. And she's also in the book and TV series The Witcher, and a topic of many songs, and I'm sure there's many, many more references that could be added to that list. But in addition to all of that fun stuff, she's also considered a Jungian archetype and a feminist. So can you talk more about those two aspects?
Yes, absolutely. Perhaps because Jungian and feminist interpretations of Lilith rely so heavily, I would say, on Lilith as portrayed in the Alphabet of Ben Sira, maybe I should quickly explain what the Alphabet of Ben Sira had to say about Lilith.
Sure.
And then from there, yes. So as we have laughed about this satirical medieval text, portrayed Lilith as Adam's first wife before Eve. She was created by God from her own mound of dirt, and therefore was, created alongside Adam instead of Adam. Lilith refused to submit to Adam subsequently, citing that both her and Adam were created from their own dust. She then spoke the ineffable name of God and fled Eden for the Red Sea, which was a site that I guess was notorious for being full of demons and monsters. And when she got there, she had sex with numerous demons, bore a demonic brood, and in the meantime, Adam was lamenting that she left. So to rectify this, God sent 3 angels, Sinoi, Sansinoi, and Samangeloth, to retrieve Lilith. She refused to go back to Eden with them, even by threat of death. And her rationale was twofold. So first, she demanded that the angels leave her alone because it was her duty. She was created for the sole purpose of harming infants. And then in a later edition, an edited version of the alphabet of Ben Sira, written probably to rectify the Lilith's seeming ability to say no to angels and God, which would then suggest that she was perhaps more powerful than these angels or God. It was written that she told the angels she could not return to Adam because she had already had sex with the great demon, and therefore she was defiled for her husband. But nonetheless, Lilith made a pact with these angels that she wouldn't harm any infant who was wearing, an amulet or a talisman that had their 3 names inscribed on it. And she also consented to the murder of 100 of her demonic children every day. So this tale, of course, establishes Lilith as not only a insubordinate, monstrous, wild feminine figure, but also the anti-mother as well. And then subsequently, we see later in Kabbalistic demonology, Lilith's 2 roles are really the seducer of men and the strangler of children. So this is kind of from the alphabet of Ben Sira, her main presentation. And then we come to feminist and psychoanalytic interpretations and analyses of Lilith who primarily pull from the alphabet of Ben Sira, or the Lilith in the alphabet of Ben Sira. There is some overlap between feminist and Jungian discourses on Lilith, such as Barbara Koltov-Black, who is a feminist Jungian who wrote a book on Lilith. But generally, these 2 discourses utilize Lilith in contrary ways. So the feminist engagement with the Lilith myth is overall aims to kind of critique the ways in which discourses on Lilith have been constructed and presented, endeavoring to provide counter narratives and reimaginations of Lilith, retelling her myth. And basically by valorizing and rewriting Lilith, feminists then challenge patriarchal conceptions of womanhood and use Lilith as like a beacon of independence and liberation. But psychoanalysis, on the other hand, largely perpetuates these patriarchal bioessentialistic notions within its treatment of Lilith as an embodiment of the dark side of the feminine and the dark side of the anima. Actually, religious studies scholar Koku von Stukrad wrote a really great article comparing Lilith's treatment in both discourses, and actually critiques psychoanalysis, pointing that psychoanalytic interpretations of Lilith generally just reproduce more assumptions and antiquated notions about women and gender. And he even says that psychoanalysis, or Lilith, was made a witch twice, first by history and then by psychoanalysis. So I also would align myself, a little bit more with von Stukrad and the feminist reclamations of Lilith. And overall, it seems as though feminist reclamations of Lilith and other mythic monstrous femmes like Medusa, they're founded in the idea that narratives, discourse, and mythology has power. So power to instruct or caution, the power to empower or subjugate. So it could be argued that myth and legend in this way play such a deep-seated role in the formation of cultural assumptions, codes, value systems. But alternatively, myth can also play a powerful role in the creation and maintenance of oppression. So feminists kind of running with this underlying theme took Lilith critiqued the way that Lilith has been presented, provided counter narratives, valorized her, challenged how the patriarchy constructs womanhood, and turned her into this beacon of independence and a patriarchy smashing heroine. Instead of vilifying her for leaving Adam in the alphabet of Ben Sirad, they praise her for leaving an abusive marriage where her boundaries weren't respected or she was expected to submit, etc. And so Lilith, actually, there is a long history of feminists using Lilith for these means dating back to the 1800s, but especially in the 20th century, which is where I'm mostly looking at Lilith. The feminist collective, the Daughters of Lilith, was named after her. And ironically, their main thing was reproductive rights, which I think is a little on the nose, but I love it. And then this feminist author, Erica Young, wrote a book called Fear of Flying and used Lilith as this figure or example of leaving an abusive marriage. The Jewish feminist magazine Lilith magazine came out in the 70s. We have Lilith Fair, the all-female headlining music festival. And then also with feminism does come an intuitive segue into associations between Lilith and lesbians. So there was the Lilith Theater in San Francisco, again founded in the 70s, which is the oldest lesbian feminist theater in the States. And there was also a poem by Jacqueline Lapidus called Eden, which kind of describes a semi-sexual relationship between Lilith and Eve. And so basically, these feminist iterations represent Lilith as someone who is fearsome and powerful and an outcast, which would make her attractive to any subaltern group, really, but I know we'll get to that later. But in psychoanalysis, as I said before, it kind of just largely reproduces essentialist and patriarchal notions within the treatment of Lilith as an archetype of the dark shadow feminine. I read the works of Sigmund Hurwitz, who trained with Jung himself, so I think he is a good example of a psychoanalytic treatment of Lilith. And he wrote about how the Lilith archetype affects men and women in modern day. And so for men, Lilith approaches either externally through a Lilith-like surrogate woman, or internally through the dark side of the anima. And Hurwitz warns that if a man interacts with Lilith, either externally or internally from a place of fear or from too much fascination, he can become unmanly or effeminate. So therefore, Lilith is a threat to healthy masculinity. And then for women, Lilith represents a fear of their own destructive aspects. And so he has this Lamashtu Lilith archetype and an Ishtar Lilith archetype. And basically, if a woman is aligned with the Lamashtu Lilith archetype, the results are destructive. She becomes an overbearing mother, versus the Ishtar Lilith archetype, where a woman develops too much promiscuity or manliness. And so all in all, I mean, even though there are, like I said, feminist psychoanalytic interpretations of Lilith, still they're bioessentialistic and founded, I think, in gender stereotypes and antiquated notions. But to be fair and to critique the feminist interpretations of Lilith a little bit, they also are a bit founded in these gender binaries and don't engage with the full scope of Lilith.
Very interesting. And that last part, of course, then leads into other expressions of identity. So yes. And you mentioned in your paper that subversion and transgression, which are qualities that are associated with Lilith many times, they link Lilith to queerness. Now, this is all still very new to me, so could you elaborate on what this means, what you mean by this?
Sure. Just, briefly, a simple understanding of queerness could be the refusal of the fixedness of the boundaries of gender and sexuality. But it could also be a refusal of the fixedness or stability of boundaries and constraints in general. Queerness, in that sense, is that which transgresses boundaries and subverts boundaries, deconstructs structures and oppressive powers. And discourses on Lilith do just that. Actually, it was what I perceived as Lilith's pseudo-queer involvement with the Genesis myth, as told in the Alphabet of Ben Sirah, that kind of initially sparked my interest in examining her through a queer lens. Because it could be argued that these harsh binaries and constructs of sexuality and gender have been upheld or even mythically initiated by the first man and woman being Adam and Eve. So not only do these two represent that hegemonic binary of man and woman, but they also represent the binary of heterosexual and homosexual. As the catchy saying goes, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? So, this Genesis myth has not only perpetuated androcentric and patriarchal concepts, but also heteronormative discourses and ideas as well. And then enter Lilith, who is this chaotic third element who basically comes and muddies and spoils and therefore queers this Genesis myth and the dynamic between Adam and Eve and the subsequent kind of hegemonic notions of this myth. And in this way, Lilith has been troubling gender and sexuality from the beginning. So ultimately, this is all to say that I think non-normativity is intuitively linked to queerness. And if I also may add, that monstrous is intuitively linked to queerness. Now, I wasn't quite sure in the beginning of my research if I would find any concrete historical associations between Lilith and queerness, but her subversive and transgressive and monstrous features kind of gave me a hunch that I would, and then I did, of course. Because where there is something monstrous, there's often queerness, in my opinion.
This is very interesting because I personally don't associate non-heteronormativity with all of these disparaging terms that are used. So how do you personally feel about the words like subversion, transgression? I guess you could see those words as being a little bit more neutral in their character and in their flavor, but oftentimes these words are used as very negative concepts. And that's what I always found a little bit disappointing, is that, Lilith was, even though there are, fictional stories and myths and legends about Lilith, I never really felt Lilith was a bad person. Personally, I never thought she was a bad person. I thought she was just standing up for herself. And she was just saying, don't push me around. And I don't see that as being a bad thing. I totally get what you're saying, that anything that challenges binaries and, hegemony and things like that, I'm with you all the way. It's just there's this emotional, I guess, conflict that I have within myself, because I never really saw her as being an evil character. I know that's how she's portrayed, but so do you get what I'm saying? I kind of have trouble with the words that are being used that are associated with her, but I understand within the theory itself, you're going to be using those terms. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm completely on board with what you're saying. It shouldn't be a transgressive act to just stand up for yourself or have a boundary, right? Like you say, I thought Lilith was just sticking up for herself. Totally. I think that when Lilith has kind of been utilized by the patriarchy as kind of a weapon, or weaponized in the sense that Lilith has historically been this kind of cautionary tale of this monstrous feminine who's a demon to kind of caution women from allowing these traits of independence or sexual autonomy or, I don't know, anti-motherhood or from developing within themselves. So I'm on board with you. I don't think that it's subversive or transgressive to, like you said, stick up for yourself. And also I'm queer, so I don't believe that queer people are monsters, but I'm, talking about of course, just more like the androcentric, patriarchal kind of cis-normative society, and also the way that Lilith has been used or viewed in an androcentric lens before the feminists came along and were like, no, actually, here's the flip side of Lilith. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
it does.
I agree with you.
Well, thank you for helping me to, I don't know, accept things, I guess. Come to some terms with this, okay? But I think this has to do more with... Also, go ahead.
I was just going to say, being subversive and transgressive and kind of jumping over these boundaries, I think... they're used as polemical or negative terms, but I think that being transgressive and subversive is pretty badass. So I think alternatively, it's it's very, very Lilith.
That you were arguing in your paper that Lilith hadn't really been analyzed yet using critical queer theory. So what I was kind of getting at, kind of hinting at, I guess, with my frustration, has to do with the way that words are used in this theory and how the terms are, what they represent and how they're used in arguing. But your research is attempting to use this theory. So I was wondering if maybe you could just briefly talk about what critical queer theory is, so that the viewers can also have a better understanding of where you're coming from with your research.
Yeah, sure. That's great. Queer theory is a relatively new academic field. It only emerged in the 1990s, branching off of both feminist studies and gender studies. And queer theory was actually deeply inspired by on-the-ground queer activist groups, such as ACT UP or Transsexual Menace. And it's also kind of this site in which postmodernism, lesbian feminism, trans activism, et cetera, all kind of melted together. Queer theory questions the foundations of sexual identities, embodiments, expectations, gender roles, but it's also so much more than just an academic study of same-sex desire. One of my favorite queer theorists, Heather Love, notes that queer theory is about race, class, citizenship, disability, borders, temporality, kinship and friendship, shame, marginalization. It can be a tricky field to kind of pin down and define because it's so similar to other fields and it encompasses so much. Also like postmodernism, queer theory troubles normative understandings and conceptions, yet unique from postmodernism and a lot of other fields and schools of thought, queer theory is founded upon and still interacts with histories of activism and resistance. Queer theory is also anti-normative and anti-assimilationist, which is why kind of these words of subversion and transgression come up. But it's also not necessarily synonymous with transgression or anti-normativity. Queer theory's main edge is I would say deconstruction, and the true radicality lies in deconstruction, not just opposition. So yes, it can be understood as a transgression, deconstruction of categories, and also the construction of alternative categories in terms of sexual and gender identities. Now, I personally think that queer theory is useful in examining and deconstructing categories beyond sexual and gender identities as well. When you queer something, when queer becomes a verb, it's just destabilizing and muddying and messing something up. Although queer theory is a relatively new field, queer themes and embodiments and narratives exist throughout history. That's part of what my research is trying to do, is a historical examination that is seeking, through a queer lens, these queer themes and semiotics, specifically concerning Lilith. Because overall, the outliers or the outcasts of sexuality and the outcasts of gender complicate these binarical systems and become agents of social chaos. And so within also the context of queerness as chaotic and destabilizing, examining Lilith, I think, through a queer lens makes sense. She, like I said, has been an agent of gender and sexual chaos since the beginning, within and outside of religious contexts. So.
Right. I like that you highlight that it's not only deconstructing, but it's reconstructing. And that's always how I see it. Also with my own research, with other kin. This is also a group that is, it challenges the boundaries of what it means to be a person. And I think it offers new possibilities of looking at other ways, looking at new possibilities, looking at new expressions. And I see that as a very good thing, positive thing. And more inclusive and plural. So for me, these are all just great things. I'm not the one that's harping on all the negative sides of everything. I'm trying to look for the good and the pragmatic, and how we can use this for a good purpose. So I think that's an important point that you mentioned about that. So. But let's get into your research now. Enough of my blah, blah. So how is it that you are actually attempting to queer Lilith? You mentioned in your paper that the poet Renee Vivien plays a role in this. So if you could expand on that, I would love to hear it.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a wealth of scholarship on Lilith in a feminist context. And also, on the other hand, there's this fascinating body of scholarship that examines the intersections of queerness and monstrosity. And so my research wants to bridge those, essentially. If I can talk about monsters for just a moment, sure. Monsters are the personification of otherness within sameness. Monsters are the abject, the chaos that threatens social order. And hating a monster, we especially see this with Lilith, hating a monster becomes a religious act. And even in our secular world, we can see the demonization and persecution of what is deemed as monstrous in institutions like law, psychology, in the construction of social taboos, etc. The queer, you can even see in the queer kind of coming out process. And speaking of which, Harry M. Benshoff writes an amazing book called Monsters in the Closet, kind of on these intersections of queerness and the monstrous. But, even just in something such as coming out of the closet, it is in a sense, exposing oneself to this cisnormative and heteronormative society as something that is coded as monstrous. You're actually coming out of the closet as an agent of sexual or gender anarchy to the normative kind of frameworks. Even, we see in pop culture, monsters are queer coded, such as vampires, werewolves, even in Disney movies, the lion Scar, definitely queer coded. Ursula from The Little Mermaid, totally queer coded. in addition, I mean, I will talk about Renee Vivien in a moment, but she had a lot of critics, and this one critic, Charles Maurras, who was a French nationalist, right-wing, kind of proto-fascist, wrote an essay critiquing Renee Vivien that kind of just ended with a rant against lesbians, as they do. And of course, in the 19th century, early 20th century, lesbianism was not, or homosexuality in general was not a common or accepted thing. And Charles Maurras, when talking about Vivian and her out lesbianism, states that lesbianism must be diagnosed and the monster eradicated. And so again, there's such a intersection between the monstrous and queerness. And I really think that Lilith embodies both just perfectly. And so this is a long-winded answer, but that's what I'm doing, by utilizing a historical approach, employing queer theory alongside monster theory and looking to the feminists to see how they kind of reconstructed her mythic archetype. I'm aiming at a preliminary examination of looking for these historical associations between Lilith and queerness, because they do exist and no one is talking about them. So this is not only to uncover, more discourses on Lilith, but this is also a case study in cisnormative and heteronormative fears of the queer other. Lilith isn't only the monstrous feminine, but I'm arguing she's also the monstrous queer. And so Renee Vivien is one of these instances where Lilith, I'm trying to overall draw attention to instances where Lilith is a site of associations between queerness and the monstrous, where this is either reproduced or subverted. And specifically, I don't know if I've mentioned, I'm looking specifically at these queer currents and themes in Lilith discourses of the 20th century. So therefore, I'm not really trying to queer Lilith myself per se, like in a creative way. I'm more just, even though that's so fun to do, I'm more just researching historical figures and movements that have aligned Lilith with sexual and gender queerness. Renee Vivien is a huge part of my research because she aligns Lilith and queerness, creating Lilith to kind of be an ally to lesbians, which is great because in other 20th century discourses on Lilith and queerness, it's not so positive. The neo-Gnosticism of Colombian sex magic practitioner and guru Samuel Unware associates Lilith and homosexuals in a very negative way, as does this American conspiracy theorist and kind of neo-Nazi Eustace Mullins, who kind of believes in a centuries-old satanic drama at the heart of all conspiracies and believes that Lilith is the mother of lesbians and homosexuals. So again, kind of weaponizes Lilith against queer people, but not Renee Vivien, because she heralds Lilith, yes, as an icon of misandry, a beacon of hope, and a lesbian ally, I would say. Okay. But I could go on for Renee Vivien forever. I can speak more to her specifically if you'd like.
Well, something that maybe I should just ask right now. I was very interested to hear you talk about how Lilith and not Satan was like the focus of, I can't remember now if you said the focus of Renee Vivien's work specifically, but more as maybe a inspirational figure, because Satan was so popular in French culture at that time, turn of the century, Satanism. This was like the thing. Everybody wanted to be a Satanist. And yet you pointed out very, very interestingly that actually we could see Lilith as playing this pivotal role. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I would really enjoy that, to hear that again.
Yeah. So, I mean, Satan definitely is aligned with these more progressive 19th century notions of feminism. Per Faxneld wrote a fantastic book on this exactly called Satanic Feminism. And actually Renee Vivien did write a lot about Satan in her poems. But what Renee Vivien did with Satan was aligned Satan with womanhood, she was a symbolist poet. So using these symbolic tropes such as the night, and violets and Sappho, she was aligning Satan with the feminine and God with the masculine. And again, Renee Vivien, I should preface by saying that she absolutely hated men, heterosexuality, marriage, childbirth, and she, her work consistently centered around women. It sanctified lesbianism, and it attacked men and heterosexuality and the patriarchy. So she was using Satan in that way, as kind of the subversive or transgressive figure, but I think that she was more so using Lilith in her poems. There are several poems in which Satan and Lilith appear at the same time. But Lilith isn't kind of represented in these poems as being a servant of Satan. She's represented as being her own kind of autonomous being. And if anything, Satan is kind of maybe even a little under her, in my own interpretation of some of her works. Okay. So, Renee Vivien basically just sought to subvert and undermine these masculinist narratives and discourses by revisiting and transforming familiar tales. So she used a lot of mythic and biblical and historic women who she felt were misrepresented, misunderstood, or vilified by androcentric constructions of history. And of course, this was a clever tactic, because this plays on the reader's familiarity with a narrative before she kind of flips it on its head. And, all of her work in general is it's gynocentric, it's sapphic, anti-male, anti-establishment, anti-heterosexuality. But this is all to say that Satan kind of wasn't the star of Renee Vivien's work, or the most kind of feminine or lesbian-friendly or subversive element of her work. Rather, it's all of these female muses that she uses to sanctify homosexuality, to valorize lesbianism, to provide a historical precedent for rebellious women to reemerge and to kind of reinvigorate this historic tradition of the rebel. In fact, this is actually going off topic, but Renee Vivien's heroines would often choose death over subservience to any man in her poems. And so, for all of these reasons, you can see a real kind of kinship with Lilith. I think, if I can talk for a moment about this kind of kinship between Lilith and Renee Vivien, I really think that Renee Vivien, she was looking for all of these mythic muses like Andromeda, Sappho, Vashti, Artemis, Athena, all of these women to kind of retell their stories, as I said, but I think she really connected with Lilith, not just by virtue of hating men and authority, but also by virtue of ostracization. And I think that that's a really important element of Renee Vivien's work. And that, I think, is what connects Lilith to Renee Vivien more than any other muse, because Renee Vivien was just acutely and painfully aware of the social, medical, and religious kind of condemnation of her sexuality, and she herself felt as an outcast due to her lesbianism. But she viewed homosexuality as natural, and instead of ever pandering to society to accept her due to her shameful, condition, she instead aggressively positioned herself against society, against the masses, against the patriarchy, heterosexuality in her poetry. And also she had a soft spot for other outcasts, such as witches. So she wrote this beautiful poem about how witches have the right to exist and be born, and how they're persecuted and they stand against the sun or the daylight, which is men and the patriarchy. And so I feel like these figures that Renee Vivien were using of strong and demonized feminine were really the feature of her work, even though Satan did make some cameos in her work. And Satan was also crafted by Vivian as an ally to women and to lesbians, and she aligned herself with Satan poetically in this way, but he wasn't, the main character by any means. This fin de siècle obsession with Satan definitely bled into her work, but didn't take over her work.
I see. Okay. How was she received in her day?
Not super well. Even her critics, such as Charles Maurras, the French nationalist that I had mentioned, even in his critique of Renee Vivien, he began his essay heralding her skill. Because, like you had mentioned earlier, she wasn't born French, she was born British. And when she finally moved to France in the end of the 1800s, she only spoke French. She only wrote in French. She immersed herself. She wanted to master the kind of French prose. And these native French speakers, and even a French nationalist such as Charles Maurras was so impressed by her command and mastery of the French poetic form. He even said that Renee Vivien surpassed Baudelaire. And so, yes, so it was interesting because she was so talented in her poetry, but she was writing a lot of, beyond writing these poems that are kind of revalorizing the mythic, demonized, or misunderstood woman, she was also writing a lot of lesbian love poems. When she first began publishing, she published under R. Vivian. And her reception was much better then because people were reading these love poems thinking it was a man talking about a woman. And then once she started publishing under Renee Vivien, and her lesbianism, which she never tried to hide, was really kind of put out there. That's when she started getting critiques more heavily. And when she kind of was feeling, the hatred, from the masses and feeling misunderstood and having these depressive episodes. So she actually ended up withdrawing a lot of her own works from circulation. And then after she died at the young age, only 32, her works were sealed in the National Library in Paris, and they weren't even, some of them were, of course, still released and in circulation, but more of her works or her letters were sealed and they weren't released until, I believe, 2000. So yes, and this, I think this stems, or not stems, this better helps us understand her hatred of the masses. Some scholars just say that Renee Vivien was a rich and privileged elitist, but I only think that's part of the story. Like, yes, she hated the masses, but she also, she had a deeply traumatizing childhood. She was an out lesbian in the late 1800s, early 1900s. She felt society's hatred towards her, and so she really just reflected that back, especially when she started being received as not as well as when she was publishing under a more vague name. Yeah.
Right. That's very interesting. It sounds like she was ahead of her time. But now that now that her work has been released, is she experiencing now kind of a second life? Are people now really starting to find her again and celebrate her now in a different light because we think differently? Most people now think differently about. Has she experienced like a blossoming now of people appreciating her work?
I personally think that she still is pretty overlooked or underappreciated, or not as well known as I think she should be. Not only for the virtue that she had just such command of the French poetic style, and not only for the virtue that her poems are so kind of saturated with feminist themes and queer themes and occult themes, of course. But I think that Renee Vivien being overlooked is also a shame, because at least in my research on queering Lilith, Renee Vivien is kind of the standout queer icon to me. So it is. I think that she is still overlooked. I would like my research on her to bring her a little bit more recognition. A lot of her biographers have written about her before the 2000s, and there have been articles that have come out since engaging with the new and released material, but not enough, in my opinion. So,
well, hopefully interviews like this will start to shed a little bit more light on her and her work. Is her work only published in French? Is it translated into any other languages?
Her work is only published in French, and there are some translations, but there isn't kind of one official translated collection. And some translations I've read, comparing it to the original or comparing one translation to a different translation, don't seem to remain super consistent. So I would love to see a translation of, her body of works. However, I mean, all of her work pretty much is available on the, I think it's the National French Library's website, of course, in their online archives, in the original French, but,
hopefully that will come soon. Hopefully more attention will be given to her work. And, she was highly praised for her prose, even though I guess the people didn't really like her as a person, but they liked her work. It sounds like they respected her for what she did. So hopefully that will come. That would be a nice development. So your thesis is going to be about Renee Vivien?
My thesis heavily features Renee Vivien, but since I'm kind of looking for historical associations between Lilith and queerness in 20th century discourses, I'm also talking about Samuel Anwar, who I mentioned, the neo-Gnostic sex magical practitioner, and then Eustace Mullins and how he represented Lilith in his kind of satanic conspiracy theories.
Well, this sounds fascinating.
Yes, but
so
definitely.
I hope you'll make that available once you finish it, if you'll post it on Academia or something like that, because I would love to read it. I'm serious about that, because this was a really different area than what I am normally looking into myself, because I'm not really looking into literary aspects of occultism specifically. I mean, if it comes across my path, then I will, but I'm a little bit in a different area. So I really like to engage with new ideas and new areas. So this, to me, I really loved your paper. So I was so happy when you agreed to come to talk about it here. So thank you for that. One last question. Where can people find you or follow you?
Well, I am on academia.edu, and I'm also on Instagram.
I will be sure to have that link available for the viewers. So thank you so much for coming to talk to me today about Lilith and Renee Vivien. I hope that the viewers will find this as interesting as I do and did. That's all we have for today. Thank you so much, Brennan. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you next time. And have a great